Hello everybody, welcome to episode 10 of Sound Design September. Today we're going to be taking a look into some acid sounds, but these are going to be slightly different than the acid sounds that we saw in episode 7. Now this is going to be a patch that I personally use a lot of the time, but I also heard very similar ideas in tracks by Outsiders, Faders, Electric Universe. And this technique is also often used by my good friend Mind B, who is one of the co-founders together with me of Eclipse Sound Syndicate, which is the label that I currently release on. So you really hear this sound kind of everywhere. So the sound that I'm talking about is this one. So as you can hear, we have this nice aggressive acid-like sound, but it's not really like the actual acid that we saw before. As I said, something like this. This of course has that plucky modulated feeling to that, whereas this one really has a sliding feeling to it. And that's because the filter cutoff of this particular patch isn't actually modulated. If you've seen that other video before, you'll know how important that is for the actual acid sound. But we still see that same low pass with high resonance, so we're still getting that same kind of focused energy out of it. The only different thing that we're doing really is that we're distorting that focus a lot more. So out of this kind of bubble over here, we're generating a lot more upper harmonics to fill in this space. And that is really where all of the aggression and the grittiness is coming from in this sound. Now you can see that what we're sending into it is just 2 saw waves. You can see that this one is an octave higher and it has 7 voices of unison and a little bit of detune. The idea really is that you want to get a full spectrum of frequencies that we can then filter out and make sure that at any stage of the filter cutoff, there's going to be some energy happening within this little bubble over here created by the resonance. And we then make that a little bit more complex by using the hyper and the dimension here to generate some stereo wave, which we're already doing over here, but this just makes it a little bit more interesting. And the real reason why we want to generate stereo wave is because we want to get that detail sound, which comes in when the left channel and the right channel are distorting differently. Notice how a lot of the small details of the sound are different between the left and the right channel. Now, I'm not going to go over these graphs again. I'm not going to explain how these graphs work over here. There's actually a video on my channel that I made recently on gritty sounds that actually goes over it. What I will say though, the more complex that this shape is, the more grittiness that you're going to get out of it and the more high frequencies, up until the point where you can get really noisy sounds out of it. So in terms of the texture, what we're aiming for is something like semi-complex. In this case, we are using asymmetrical distortion. And given that we're pushing negative sides into the positives and positive sides back into the negatives, what that is going to mean is that this is technically asymmetrical distortion, as Seamless R would say it. And this is a technique that I started to use more and more recently, and that is also the reason why I'm growing out my beard. Of course, when you're using asymmetrical distortion, you have to look like Seamless R as well. But anyway, that means that this distortion is really at the heart of what the sound does. So if we turn it off, you can hear that we get a completely different sound. Of course, the melody is still there and that focus is still there, but the focus with this turned on is really being drawn out because the higher frequencies are filled up so much. Again, because of this very strong distortion. Of course, another thing that helps with that is the multiband compressor over here. And then the final effects that we have is just a high pass to get rid of lower frequencies and our standard delay and reverb. Now, in terms of the melody, it is basically the same as any other ARP that I tend to write. What you'll see is that the lower notes are only in the root note. And then we have the main melody up top over here. That means that for the supportive elements, we're going to get the higher harmonics mainly in this filter. So for the lower notes, the higher harmonics are going to be occupying this resonance spot over here. Whereas for the highest notes, of course, lower harmonics are going to be sitting in that spot. Now that's going to be the example patch. Now let's make a patch from scratch. Before we do that, I quickly want to remind you that all of the patches that you're going to see in this video are going to be available up on my Patreon page. So if you want to support the channel, that is a great way of doing it, and you'll get some amazing patches for that in return. Now with that out of the way, let's get into making this sound over here. So I'm going to go back into Serum. Really, Serum is a very good option for this just because of the different distortions that you can get with the asymmetrical shape over here, where you can edit it yourself. I also quickly want to shout out a bunch of other plugins that you can use for this. In terms of distortion, what I really like to use is this MD-MX fuzz stereo or overdrive stereo over here. The Screamer is a little bit less aggressive, so that doesn't really get me the characteristics that I want. But these plugins over here tend to do very cool distortion as well. And of course, an oldie but goldie is going to be Isotope Trash. This again allows you to make your own graphs if you wanted to. If you want to make it bipolar, you can do asymmetrical distortion just like we did before. Something like this maybe. Of course, the shape is a little bit different, but you get the idea in that this is the same kind of graph as we saw in Serum. So because the distortion in this patch is going to be so important, I would recommend you that you experiment with it a lot. In this case, I am just going to stick to the Serum patch so that the patch is going to work straight out of the box, meaning that we are going to use the filter over here, which we're just going to set up like this. Again, we're just going to create the focus over here. We probably also want the higher octave going through this. Let's give this a little bit of detune so that the waveform becomes a little bit more complex. And then we'll go into hyperdimension and distortion. For the hyper, I like to turn that down by quite a lot. And for the dimension, I like the size all the way down. And then over here in the distortion, I'm going to set the drive all the way to the B point over here so that we can edit B. And we can just draw in the shape that we want, and it will be represented in here one-on-one. So we're just going to draw an asymmetrical shape, meaning that for the positive values, which is this part of the graph, we are going to push it into negative values, which is this part of the graph. So essentially the way that you can read this graph is that the x-axis is going to get remapped to the y-axis based on the graph that we have. Of course, now everything is mapped 1 to 1. So 1 to 1, 1 to 1. But let's say that we want to take the positive values and push them a little bit into the negatives as well. Just make this a little bit more complex. Any value over here is going to be pushed to this y value. And any value over here is going to be pushed to a negative y value. Of course, this cross over here is 0, and this cross over here is 0 on the x-axis. So this is 0 to 1, and this is 0 to -1, 0 to 1, and 0 to -1. And for those that don't know, because this is a distortion and it doesn't have any time factors like attack and release, this is going to be per sample of the signal that is going through it. And that is why this kind of stuff is called a remap graph, which you shouldn't confuse, by the way, with the remaps that are in here. This is not the same kind of remap graph. This is a time remapping graph, whereas this is an amplitude remapping graph. So we're literally taking the amplitude of every signal and changing its value based on the graph that we draw in here. Now already we should get a very distorted sound. That is nice. Of course, we're getting the effect of the hyper as well. And of course of the detuning here. So you can already hear that we're starting to get those kind of complex sounds out of it, where it's just continuously morphing and the distortion is reacting to that. Let's compress it a little bit more and let's remove some of the lower frequencies here. That is basically our patch now. Of course, we can add delay and reverb as well, but I'm just going to copy over the MIDI here. And as you can see, the final thing that we want to do is we want to set up a modulation for the filter cutoff, because that is really what determines the tonality and the brightness of the sound. In the last example, what we saw is this just going up over time, up until the point where the fill is. So the fill is over here and then it goes back down. But of course, you can also record something interesting with a MIDI controller, for example. So in order to do that with a MIDI controller, I'm going to set the filter cutoff to the lowest position that we want. And I'm going to assign a macro to it. Of course, you can set the macro amount and the filter cutoff later as well after you've recorded it. Because now we can go in here, hit configure to make sure that this knob is showing up over here. This means that it's now targetable by MIDI. So let me just set up the MIDI controller over here, hit MIDI map, and then move one of my sliders here. And now when moving the slider, we can record a little bit more of a complex automation for this sound. Now, of course, we can work a little bit more on the details. I think this one is maybe a little bit too strong. So let's maybe edit the shape a little bit while playing back. What could also be interesting is seeing how glide is going to affect this. So let's turn on mono, legato and always and turn this up a little bit. So as you can hear, you can get some quite cool aggressive sounds out of that. Now that's going to be it for today. I hope that you enjoyed this video and that you enjoyed the patches, which are again available up on my Patreon page. Another way to support the channel is by watching some more of my content, so there will be 2 videos up on the screen for you to choose from. So just pick one and enjoy, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.